I found out on a Tuesday in March because of a parking receipt. Not a text message, not a lipstick on a collar, not some dramatic confession at 2 a.m. A parking receipt from a garage on Commerce Street in Nashville that I found in the pocket of her coat when I was dropping it off at the dry cleaner. $16. Stamped 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday in February. The same Thursday she told me she was working late and wouldn't be home until 9 because they had an audit prep meeting that was running long. Her office is on the west side of Nashville. Commerce Street is downtown. Those are not the same direction. I stood in the dry cleaner parking lot on a Tuesday morning in March, holding that receipt, and I thought, okay. And then I drove home, and I put the receipt on the kitchen counter, and I made dinner, and I waited for her to get home. She got home at 6:15, kissed me on the cheek, asked what I was making. I said pasta. She said great, she was starving, and I watched her walk past the counter and past the receipt without once glancing at it, which meant either she didn't see it or she was better at this than I'd ever imagined. My name is Caleb Marsh. I'm 38 years old. I'm a project manager at a civil engineering firm outside Nashville, Tennessee. We do infrastructure work, highway contracts, county drainage systems, the kind of work that doesn't sound impressive at dinner parties, but pays consistently and builds over time. I met my wife Natalie 11 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday party in East Nashville. She was standing near the back of the apartment with a glass of red wine, and she said something dry and funny about the music, and I laughed, and that was that. We dated for 3 years, got married at a venue in Franklin with 114 guests and a band that played until midnight. I thought I knew her. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I want to tell this the right way, which means starting with who she was, who I believed she was, before I tell you what I found out. Natalie was 36, senior accountant at a mid-sized logistics company downtown. By every visible measure, she was exactly the person I thought I'd married. Smart in a quiet way, not the kind of person who performed intelligence, just the kind who never needed to say the same thing twice. Organized in a way I never quite was. She kept a running grocery list on her phone and always knew what was in the refrigerator, and I cannot emphasize enough how much I am not that kind of person. She remembered people's birthdays, sent thank you notes after things, always knew the right amount to tip. We had a house in Brentwood, 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, a backyard that needed work which I kept meaning to get to. We had a dog named Cooper, a 7-year-old golden retriever who believed with his whole heart that his purpose in life was to be in whatever room you were currently occupying. We had a routine. Weeknights she cooked, or I cooked, depending on who got home first. Weekends we'd go to whatever was happening, a friend's thing, her sister's place in Murfreesboro, the farmer's market on Saturday mornings sometimes. We watched a lot of television. We had, I genuinely believe this, a good life. I want to be precise about that because I think it matters. It wasn't a marriage that was visibly falling apart. There was no period of obvious distance or constant arguing or the slow frost you hear people describe when they say they'd been unhappy for years. We got along. We laughed at the same things. We had what felt like genuine conversations. A Tuesday in November, 2 years before any of this, I came home to find her already on the couch with a bottle of wine open and a documentary about the Dust Bowl queued up on the television. She'd had a bad day, something about a quarterly audit that had gone sideways. I sat next to her, and she tucked her feet under my leg without saying anything, and we watched 2 hours of archival photographs of cracked Oklahoma farmland. And at some point she fell asleep against my shoulder, and I diced. The Saturday mornings at the farmer's market on 8th Avenue were a real thing. She'd drink black coffee from the stand near the entrance and move through the stalls methodically. Same vendors in the same order every week. There was a woman who grew heirloom tomatoes in Sumner County, and Natalie had a genuinely warm relationship with her, the kind built over years of small exchanges. She'd compare the brandy wines against whatever new variety the woman was trying that season, with a seriousness that I found funny, and she knew I found funny, and that was its own private joke between us. Coming home afterward, reusable bags in the back seat, splitting the Saturday crossword at the kitchen table while the coffee finished. Those mornings had a texture I trusted completely. Once, about 18 months before the parking receipt, we drove to Murfreesboro on a Sunday to help her sister Karen with some furniture she'd bought at an estate sale. A dresser, 2 chairs, a mirror that needed rehanging. Karen's husband Mike was working, so it was the 3 of us. We spent 4 hours moving furniture around Karen's house, debating whether the dresser looked better in the hall or the bedroom, and eating chips from a bag in the kitchen between attempts. I'm not good at interior decisions, and they both knew it and periodically asked my opinion anyway, just to dismiss it, which was funny every time. Driving back that evening, Natalie fell asleep in the passenger seat about 15 minutes outside of Nashville, and I drove the rest of the way in the particular silence of someone else sleeping nearby, and I thought about how much I liked my life. I thought it as a specific thought, not a feeling in the background, but an actual sentence in my head. I like my life. I was not paying close enough attention. I know that now. The parking receipt sat on the counter through dinner. After we ate, she picked up her phone and scrolled while I loaded the dishwasher, and neither of us mentioned it. She went to bed at 10. I stayed up until midnight on the couch, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Commerce Street. The next morning, I went to work, and I sat at my desk, and I did what I'm trained to do. I made a list. Not an accusation, a list. Dates, times, things that hadn't quite lined up over the past several months. The way a project manager approaches a discrepancy. Here's what was scheduled. Here's what actually happened. Here's the gap between them. October. She'd been at a work conference in Memphis for 3 days. I hadn't thought to verify it at the time. I believed her completely. I remembered dropping her at the airport on a Wednesday morning. The small rolling suitcase. The quick kiss in the drop-off lane. She texted me both evenings. Long day, tired, going to bed early, and I'd sat on the couch with Cooper and watched whatever I wanted on television and thought nothing of it. When she'd come back Friday night, she'd brought me a bottle of hot sauce from a barbecue place at the airport, which is something she'd do. Thoughtful, specific, the kind of detail that doesn't occur to a person who isn't paying attention to who they're buying it for. I remembered finding that detail reassuring in some way I hadn't articulated at the time. I stopped articulating it now. November. 2 dinners that ran late, both on Thursdays. She texted both times, running behind, don't wait up, and I hadn't thought anything of it because late dinners happen. December. A Saturday morning, she'd gone to help a friend move and hadn't come home until 4 in the afternoon. I'd asked which friend. She'd said Jess from work. I didn't know Jess from work. I hadn't thought to ask more. What I remembered from that Saturday was not suspicion. It was the fact that I'd spent the morning caulking the upstairs bathroom, and when she got home she'd brought sandwiches from the place on Franklin Road, and we'd eat. That was the detail that lived in my memory from that day. The sandwiches, not where she'd been. January and February looked different now that I was looking. 3 Thursday evenings where she'd been later than her stated reason seemed to require. A weekend in February where she'd been unusually quiet in a way I'd attributed to stress about year-end close at work. I'd cooked both nights that weekend, pasta Friday, roast chicken Saturday, and I'd let her be quiet because that seemed like the right thing to do, because I thought I knew what the quietness meant. Looking at the list, I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not rage, not grief yet, more like the feeling you get when you realize a load-bearing wall isn't where the plans say it should be. Something structural is wrong. You don't know how wrong yet. I sat with that list for 3 days, went home, had dinner, slept next to my wife, got up and went to work. Normal in every visible way. I was not ready to move yet because I wasn't certain, and I didn't want to blow up a marriage over a parking receipt if there was an innocent explanation I hadn't considered. So I started looking for one. The following Thursday evening, I was in the kitchen when her phone buzzed on the counter. She was upstairs. The screen lit up with a preview, a text from someone named Jess saying, "Let me know when you're free this week." I looked at it and felt something release slightly in my chest. Jess is real. Jess texts her. Maybe the December story was true. Maybe the parking receipt had an explanation I hadn't thought of. Maybe I was doing what anxious people do, constructing a narrative out of coincidences and letting it run. I want to be clear about this moment because it matters. I almost let it go. I came within about 48 hours of deciding I was being paranoid and moving on. And then on Saturday morning, Natalie went to yoga at 9 and I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and I opened her Gmail. I want to be honest about this. I don't recommend it. It's not something I'm proud of. I knew her password because she'd asked me to check something for her 2 years earlier, and I'd never forgotten it. I opened her email and I sat there for a minute before I started reading, because I knew what I was about to do was going to change something, and I wasn't sure yet if I was ready. I started reading. The name I kept seeing was Ryan Calder. The emails went back 14 months in her inbox. That's as far as I looked before I had to stop and go outside and stand on the back porch for a while. 14 months of emails. Some were practical. Logistics, timing, a reference to a lease agreement I didn't understand yet. A few mentioned numbers. Dollar amounts I couldn't contextualize. Some were personal in a way that made me grip the porch railing and look at the neighbor's fence while I breathed. None of them were explicit. They didn't need to be. The language people use when they're intimate has a particular texture, and I know what I was reading. Ryan Calder. The name was familiar, and I couldn't immediately place it, and then I could. Ryan Calder had been at our wedding. He was from Natalie's hometown, Cookeville, Tennessee, about an hour east of Nashville on I-40. They'd grown up together, gone to the same high school. She'd mentioned him a few times over the years, always casually, always past tense. Old friend. We grew up together. Haven't seen much of him since we both moved to Nashville. I went back inside, closed her email, sat at the kitchen table with Cooper's head in my lap, and I thought about our wedding. I tried to remember Ryan Calder, tall guy, dark hair, stood near the back during the ceremony. I'd shaken his hand at the reception. He'd said congratulations, and I'd said thank you, and we'd moved on, and I hadn't thought about him once in the 8 years since. He'd been one of 114 people in a room where I'd been focused entirely on Natalie, standing across from me in the afternoon light at a venue in Franklin. I thought about her face in that light. I thought about what she knew that I didn't, standing there. I went upstairs and opened the box of wedding photographs we kept on the shelf in the closet. We'd never had them printed into an album. That was something we talked about doing and never done. So they were still in the paper envelope from the photographer, plus a USB drive with the full digital set. I sat on the bedroom floor and went through the prints. He was in 4 of them. 2 were wide shots of the reception, guests visible in the background at their tables. In one, he was standing near the bar, drink in hand, turned partially away from camera. In another, he was at a table near the left wall, talking to someone I didn't recognize. But in the third photo, a candid guests milling during cocktail hour, he was looking at Natalie. She was laughing at something someone else had said, unaware of the camera, and he was standing 10 feet away watching her, with an expression I recognized now, even though I hadn't known to look for it 8 years ago. Not longing exactly, something more settled than that, something that looked, from where I sat on the bedroom floor with the photo in my hand, like a person looking at something they considered theirs. The 4th photo was the one that stayed with me. It was from the receiving line, Natalie and I greeting guests as they came through. She was turned toward the camera in this one, shaking someone's hand, and Ryan was 2 people back in the line, waiting his turn. His expression in that one was neutral, controlled, the expression of a person managing what they were feeling in a public setting. I'd been in the same frame as that expression. I'd shaken his hand 2 minutes after it was taken. I had absolutely no memory of it. I put the photos back in the envelope. I put the box back on the shelf. I thought about the emails. I thought about the 14 months I'd actually seen, and what was likely behind the 14 months I hadn't looked at. I thought about the receiving line and what he'd said when he got to the front of it. Congratulations. I'd said thank you, and I'd meant it, and whatever he'd meant by it wasn't the same thing. I thought about the emails. I walked out to the backyard and stood in the March cold for a while. The grass was thin near the back fence. I'd been meaning to reseed it since fall. The flower bed along the left side needed edging. The whole yard needed attention that I kept not giving it. I went back inside and made coffee and tried to figure out what to do next. That afternoon, while Natalie was at her sister's in Murfreesboro, I drove downtown. I wasn't sure exactly what I was looking for. I parked on Commerce Street near the garage on the receipt, and I walked around the block. The garage was unremarkable. Standard downtown parking structure, nothing notable. But the block itself was lined with commercial buildings, some renovated, some not. I walked it once, and then took out my phone and searched Ryan Calder Nashville. The second result was a LinkedIn profile. Ryan Calder, Principal Consultant, Calder and Associates Consulting. Location, Nashville, Tennessee. I stood on the sidewalk on Commerce Street in the March wind, and I looked at that profile for a long time. Professional headshot, good suit, the easy confidence of someone who'd built something and knew it. I screenshotted it, put my phone in my pocket, walked back to my car. That evening, Natalie made dinner. Roast chicken, a green salad, the good bread from the bakery near our house, and we sat at the table and talked about her sister's new deck and whether we should redo our kitchen before. Normal conversation, the kind we'd had 1,000 times. I participated in it. I asked questions. I made it feel ordinary. I went to bed that night, and I lay in the dark, and I thought about the fact that I had been having ordinary conversations in this house for, I didn't know how long, months, years maybe. I'd been living in a version of my life that wasn't the complete version. The next afternoon, I drove to Charlotte Avenue. I told myself I was going to the hardware store. I was not going to the hardware store. I drove down Charlotte Avenue slowly until I found the address I'd cross-referenced from LinkedIn and the Secretary of State Business Entity database I'd pulled up at my desk that morning. I pulled over across the street. Small commercial building, ground floor unit, renovated, glass front, clean lines, the kind of space that signals money was spent on it without screaming it. The signage on the glass said Calder and Associates Consulting in clean sans serif letters. Below that, smaller, Strategic Financial Services. I sat in my car across the street with the engine running and I looked at it. The lights were on inside, some movement behind the glass, at least one person at a desk, maybe two. Couldn't see clearly. I sat there for about 20 minutes. Then I drove to the actual hardware store, bought a bag of mulch I didn't need, drove home. That night, after Natalie went to bed, I opened my laptop, and I spent 3 hours pulling everything publicly available on Ryan Calder and Calder and Associates, Tennessee Secretary of State Business Entity Database, county property records. The Charlotte Avenue space was leased, not owned, but I found the property owner, LinkedIn, a professional directory listing, a brief mention in a Nashville Business Journal piece from 2 years ago about regional consulting firms expanding into estate planning and trust services. Ryan Calder, 40 years old, grew up in Cookeville, finance degree from UT Knoxville, 6 years at a regional bank in Nashville before going out on his own. 3 years ago, he'd registered Calder and Associates Consulting LLC with the state of Tennessee. The registered agent was a law firm downtown. The members listed in the initial filing were Ryan Calder and a silent partner listed simply as N. Marsh. N. Marsh. I read that twice. Then I read it again. My wife was a partner in Ryan Calder's consulting firm. A silent partner, meaning her name wasn't on the signage, wasn't on the website, wasn't anywhere a husband who wasn't looking would ever find it. She'd been going to work every day at her logistics company, her real job, her W-2, the job she told me about. And somewhere alongside that, she was a partial owner of a financial consulting business on Charlotte Avenue that I had never heard mentioned once in our marriage. 3 years ago. The LLC had been formed 3 years ago. At that point, we'd been married for 5 years. I sat at the kitchen table at midnight, looking at the business filing on my laptop screen, and I thought about everything that required, not just the affair. I'd been moving toward accepting that for a week. The business, the capitalization, the decisions that had to be made, the money that had to come from somewhere. I closed my laptop. I went to bed. I did not sleep. The next morning was a Monday. I went in late, told my supervisor I had an appointment, and drove to Green Hills and sat across from a divorce attorney named Patricia Haverford. I know that sounds fast. I want to explain it. I didn't go to Patricia because I'd already decided on divorce. I went because I needed to understand the dimensions of what I was dealing with before I said a single word to Natalie. There was a financial layer here I didn't have visibility into, and saying the wrong thing to the wrong person before I understood it could cost me in ways I couldn't yet calculate. Patricia wasn't a therapist. She was the person who could help me figure out what I was actually standing in. I told her what I had, the emails going back 14 months, the LLC filing, N. Marsh as silent partner. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me one question. Do you have any sense of where the capitalization came from? I said I didn't know yet. She said, that's the central question. If marital funds went into that business, the business interest is a marital asset subject to division. We need to establish that before you do anything else. She wrote a name on a notepad and slid it across the desk. Susan Cho. She's the best forensic accountant I work with. Call her today. She said one more thing before I left. Don't confront your wife yet. Don't move any money. Don't change any account access. Don't do anything that signals you know. We need a clean financial picture first. Any disruption to the normal pattern of accounts right now creates problems. I said I understood. I drove to work and sat at my desk and called Susan Cho from my car in the parking garage. Here's what it is like to decide not to confront your wife about something while continuing to live with her. It is the strangest sustained experience I have had in my adult life. You have dinner, you talk about normal things, you watch television, you take the dog for walks, and the dog is happy, completely unaware, and the dog's happiness is simultaneously comforting and unbearable, because at least someone in this house is okay. I developed a kind of discipline about it. I compartmentalized with a focus I hadn't known I was capable of. Work during the day. I threw myself into a highway interchange project that was behind schedule, and I was more productive during those 6 weeks than I'd been in months, which is a dark irony I've thought about since. Evenings I was present, normal, unremarkable. Nights I lay awake and ran calculations I couldn't finish yet. There was a dinner about 2 weeks in where she made the mushroom pasta that had been something like our official weeknight dish since we moved into the Brentwood house. We'd made it together the first night there. Test. She told a story about a coworker who'd accidentally scheduled 2 all-hands meetings at the same time, and the subsequent chaos of trying to split the company's 40 employees between 2 conference rooms in real time. I laughed. It was genuinely funny. And then I noticed I was laughing, and I had to go get a glass of water and stand at the sink for a moment. And when I came back, she was still smiling at the story she just told, and had no idea that the laugh had cost me something. One morning, in week 3, I was getting ready for work, and her phone was on the bathroom counter while she showered. A notification appeared. A calendar reminder, not a text. It said only, *RC, confirm Thursday. I read it and put the phone back exactly where it had been, and finished getting dressed, and drove to work, and sat in the parking garage for 10 minutes before I could go inside. The same week I drove past the Charlotte Avenue building again on my way back from a site visit. I didn't stop. I just looked at the lights on inside and kept driving. I thought about the fact that she had built something real over there. That was the thought that kept coming back in those weeks. Not the anger, or not only the anger, but the recognition that she had been running a parallel architecture for years, quietly and competently, and I had been. The night that almost broke the whole strategy was a Thursday in week 5. I'd gotten home first, made dinner, just a simple thing, eggs and toast. I hadn't felt like cooking. She got home late, around 8, which I was used to by now. She came through the door, and she was in a good mood, clearly, loose in a way that wasn't her usual end-of-week tiredness, genuinely upbeat. She kissed my cheek and said sorry she was late, and made herself a plate from what I'd left on the stove, and sat down across from me at the kitchen table, and started talking about nothing important, weekend plans, something she'd read, a coworker's new baby. And I sat there, and I watched her be happy, and I thought about where she'd been, and I thought about En Marsh on a filing in the Tennessee Secretary of State database, and I thought about the parking receipt that had sat, and I had to physically grip the edge of the kitchen table, under the surface where she couldn't see it, to keep my face doing what I was asking it to do. I went to bed early. I said I had a headache. She said okay and didn't follow up on it, and I lay in the dark and I thought, one more week. Susan needs one more week. The Memorial Day conversation, that Saturday, was mid-April. She was asking whether we should do something up at Dale and Amy's lake house like we had the year before, or drive out to the beach instead. I said the lake house sounded good to me. She said she'd text Amy. I sat across the table from her while she did it. I thought about the fact that there wasn't going to be a Memorial Day weekend. Not for us. Not in any form that looked like this. I didn't say that. I drank my coffee and said the lake house would be fun, and she sent the text and put her phone down and picked up the crossword. She worked it in silence for a minute, then said she was stuck on 17 across and slid it toward me without looking up. I stared at it, filled in 2 answers, slid it back. She said good, thanks, and kept going without making anything of it. And it was so completely ordinary that for about 3 minutes, I couldn't locate any of the other thing at all. It just went away. And then it came back. I called my friend Dale about 3 weeks in. Dale Whitfield had been my best man. We'd known each other since the first week of college at UT. He'd been in the room next to mine in the dorm, and we'd established a friendship over bad dining hall food and the specific misery of freshman engineering coursework. He'd been at our wedding, gave a speech that made people laugh, and then got quiet in a good way. He'd known Natalie for nearly as long as I had. I didn't tell him the full situation. I said I was going through something and needed to talk. We met at a bar near the Gulch on a Wednesday night, a place we'd been going to since our 20s, the kind of bar that never changes its menu, and that's the whole point of it. We talked for a while about surface things, his kids, my highway project, a camping trip he was planning in the Smokies. And then, as casually as I could manage, I said, "Hey, you ever run into that guy Ryan Calder, Natalie's friend from Cookville?" Dale was quiet for exactly one beat too long. "Ryan Calder," he said, not a question, just repeating the name. "Why do you ask?" I said I'd come across the name recently and was curious if Dale knew him. Dale picked up his beer. He looked at the label. He set it back down. Then he said, "I've met him a couple of times. At things over the years." He was looking at the table. "He seemed like a good guy?" I asked. "I don't know him well," Dale said. "I've known Dale for 15 years. He is genuinely one of the worst liars I've ever met. He knows this about himself and avoids lying whenever possible, specifically because of how obvious it is." What I was watching across that bar table was a man who knew something and had decided, in the 2 seconds available to him, to say as little as possible. I let it go. I ordered another round. We talked about his camping trip. I drove home. 2 things were now clear to me. The first was that Ryan Calder had been present in Natalie's life, in a way that extended to social overlap with my own friends. The second was that Dale knew something about it, and had made a choice not to tell me. I sat with both of those facts. I decided not to do anything about Dale yet. I had enough to manage. Susan Cho sent preliminary findings after 4 weeks and asked to meet. We met at a coffee shop near Vanderbilt on a Thursday morning, a place called Dose on 21st, that was narrow and always too loud, tables close together, a chalkboard menu above the bar. She got there before me, had already ordered. There was a second coffee waiting on the table, which I took as a sign that she understood how this meeting was going to go. She was methodical and precise, and communicated primarily through printed spreadsheets, which I appreciated. She had a manila folder and a legal pad, and she kept a pen in her hand the whole time without using it. She set the pages on the table between us and walked me through them without editorial. We went item by item. She didn't rush and she didn't editorialize. When she got to the total, she slid one particular page across the table and put her pen down on top of it. She didn't say anything. She just let me read it. $214,000. She let the number sit there for a moment in the ambient noise of the coffee shop, the espresso machine, someone's kid at the next table, a song I vaguely recognized playing overhead, and then she said, "That's the floor. The methodology is conservative. There may be transfers I haven't yet traced." The short version of 43 pages. Over a period of approximately 4 years, Natalie had transferred a total of $214,000 out of our joint accounts and into accounts I had no knowledge of. The transfers were small individually. The largest single transfer was $3,400. Most were between $800 and $2,000, and they'd been categorized in our shared records as routine household expenses, home repair, car maintenance, professional development, medical copays. Each one individually was the kind of number that doesn't catch your eye. Collectively, over 4 years, they added up to $214,000. I sat across from Susan and I thought about the category labels. Professional development. How many times had I seen that in a statement and not paused on it? You see a number that size and a label that clean, and you process it as background and move to the next item because you're not auditing your wife. You're just glancing at the bank statement while you eat breakfast. That's the thing about small, consistent deceptions. They don't look like deception. They look like administration. Susan said the money had flowed through 2 intermediate accounts into the capitalization of Calder and Associates Consulting LLC. Natalie's silent partnership stake was 40% of the firm. Based on current revenue estimates from available filings and industry comparables, that 40% stake was valued somewhere between $380,000 and $460,000. She had taken $214,000 of our money and turned it into nearly $500,000 in an asset she co-owned with the man she was sleeping with. 4 years, one small transfer at a time. While I came home and made dinner and thought I was living in a real marriage, I thanked Susan. I paid for the coffees. I drove home and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. That night, Natalie was in the kitchen when I got home. She was on the phone. Not a work call, I could tell from the softness of her voice, and she had her back to me. She was laughing quietly at something. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, and I felt all 6 weeks of it hit me at once. The parking receipt, Dale's silence, $214,000, N. Marsh on a business filing. I turned around and went to the back porch. I stood out there in the cold with Cooper sitting next to me, his warm side against my leg, looking at the thin grass along the back fence and the flower bed that needed edging and the yard I'd never gotten around to fixing. I stood out there for 15 minutes until I could trust myself to go back inside. I did not confront her that night. I went upstairs and said I had a headache and was going to bed early. She said okay and touched my shoulder briefly, and I said good night, and I went to the bedroom and I lay there in the dark, and I thought about the fact that the next morning I was going to call Patricia and tell her we were ready to move, but not yet, not tonight. There was one conversation I needed to have first. I chose a Saturday morning in April. She was home, no plans until the afternoon. I waited until she'd had her coffee. Natalie didn't fully exist before her first cup. That was a real and consistent thing about her. I sat down at the kitchen table. I put Susan's summary document on the table between us. 43 pages, tabbed, organized by category. I'd stayed up until 1 in the morning, putting together the clean version. She looked at the document, then she looked at me. "How long have you known?" she said. Not "what is this?" Not "I can explain." "How long have you known?" I told her about the parking receipt. March, the dry cleaner. She was quiet for a moment. She picked up her coffee mug and held it without drinking from it. And then she said, simply, "Okay." I asked her about Ryan Calder. She didn't flinch. She said they'd known each other their whole lives. She said the relationship, she used the word relationship the way you describe a business arrangement, had started about a year before she and I met. She said it had never fully stopped. I asked if she'd been with him when we were dating. She said yes. I asked if she'd been with him when I proposed. She paused. A real pause. Not evasive, more like she was deciding whether to be precise. Then she said yes. I asked her why she had married me. She set the coffee mug down. She looked at the table for a moment. The table we'd eaten at probably 2,000 times, where we'd had Thanksgiving, and where we'd done taxes, and where I'd put the parking receipt 6 weeks ago, and watched her walk past it. And then she said, "You were stable. You were good. Being with you made sense for where I was in my life. Not I loved you. Not I made a terrible mistake and I'm sorry. Not I don't know what happened. You made sense for where I was in my life." The same language she'd used to describe a decision about where to live or which job offer to take. A resource allocation. A practical choice made at a particular moment for particular reasons. I sat with that. I've thought about those words more than I expected to. Not with the kind of anger that burns. That kind moves, eventually. With something more like the mild, persistent discomfort of a thing you can't fully resolve. Because there's something almost honest about what she said, in a way. She didn't construct a prettier explanation on the spot. She told me what it had been. And I've come to think that in a different conversation, from a different person, something like that might have been respectable. The problem was that I'd been in that arrangement, resource, structure, stable substrate, without my knowledge or consent for 11 years. You were stable. You were good. I sat across the table from her in the morning light, and I thought about the wedding, the receiving line, the way Ryan had looked at her from 10 feet away in the candid photograph. I thought about what she'd looked like standing across from me in the afternoon light in Franklin, and what she'd known that I didn't, whether what she'd felt in that moment was something she'd call real by her own definition of the word. I didn't ask. I wasn't sure the answer would be useful. I asked her about the business. Her expression shifted slightly. Not guilt exactly, more like the look of someone who's been caught doing something entirely pragmatic and is being asked to justify it to someone who doesn't share their framework. She said the business had needed capital. She said she'd intended to pay it back over time. I asked over what timeline. She said she hadn't worked out a specific timeline yet. I asked if she'd considered what paying it back would look like in practical terms, from which account, in what increments, without me noticing the outflows in reverse. She stopped and looked at me. I said I was asking because I'd thought about it, and I genuinely couldn't see how the mechanics would have worked. She said it was something she'd been thinking about how to address. I said I was asking because I'd thought about it. I put Susan's spreadsheet in front of her, the page with the total, $214,000, traced transfer by transfer across 4 years. She looked at it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I was careful." I said, "I noticed." We sat in the kitchen in the morning light, and I looked at her and I thought about how good she was at this. Not the affair, Plenty of people have affairs, and plenty of them are sloppy about it. What I was thinking about was the business, the 4 years of small transfers, each one individually unremarkable. The silent partnership structure. The Charlotte Avenue office, with her name nowhere visible. She'd built something substantial and clean, and she'd done it in the margins of a marriage without leaving a trace that didn't require a forensic accountant to find. She was genuinely talented at the management of complexity. I'd always known that. I'd just been applying it to the wrong category of activity. I told her I was filing for divorce the following Monday. She nodded once, slowly, the way she nodded when she was processing something, rather than reacting to it. Then she said, "You should know that Ryan and I are planning to get married." I looked at her. There was a version of that sentence that was meant to land like a blow. The implication that this had been heading somewhere real all along. That the thing I'd been excluded from was the actual story. I sat there and I felt it in my chest, and I also recognized what it was. The one card she had left that might move me off the careful position I'd spent 6 weeks building. Make it personal enough, and maybe I react. Maybe I say something I shouldn't. Maybe I blow up the process in a way that cost me. I thought about the wedding photo, him watching her from 10 feet away. The expression of a person looking at something they consider theirs. For 11 years that had apparently been true, and I'd been the functional element in the middle of it, the stable thing that made the arrangement work. I told her I hoped they'd be very happy together. Then I got up and snapped Cooper's leash to his collar, and we walked around the neighborhood for about an hour, past the houses with their Saturday morning routines visible through windows, people having coffee, kids playing in driveways, the ordinary machinery of other people's lives. Cooper investigated every interesting smell on his usual route with total absorption. He had no idea anything had changed. When I got back, I texted Patricia, ready to proceed. The divorce took 14 months. I want to be honest about that because the version of this story where everything unfolds quickly and cleanly isn't accurate, and I found that the inaccurate version isn't actually useful to anyone who might be facing something similar. 14 months, depositions and mediations and hearings, and a period around month 8 where our respective attorneys were exchanging letters that made me feel like I was watching a negotiation over something I didn't fully recognize as my own life. The first few months were the logistics of separation. She moved out in May, found an apartment in Midtown, was out of the Brentwood house within 3 weeks of our kitchen conversation. I'm not sure where she stayed in the interim. I didn't ask. Cooper and I had the house to ourselves, and the silence was different from what I'd expected. Not the aching kind you might imagine, more like the silence after a long project finally closes. Not comfortable, but honest. There was a mediation session in October that I've thought about more than most of the other days from that period. We were in a conference room on the 15th floor of a building downtown, neutral ground, our attorneys on opposite sides, a mediator named Terrence, who had the patient effect of someone who'd done this for 20 years and had seen every version of it. There was a credenza along the wall with a coffee maker and a box of individually wrapped pastries that nobody touched. It ran 6 hours. Natalie's side came in with a position on the business valuation that was, I'll give them this, well-constructed, separate expertise, traceable premarital savings, the LLC as her separate property, in all but the capitalization question. They'd hired a valuation expert who had produced a number considerably lower than Susan's estimate. I sat across the table from Natalie for the first time since April. She was in a dark blazer, composed, every inch the person she'd always been in professional settings. She didn't look at me often. When she did, it was the flat evaluative look of someone reading a situation rather than being in one. I'd seen that look across our kitchen table many times and understood it now in a way I hadn't then. Terrence went back and forth between the rooms most of the afternoon. My attorney, a man named Garrett, who had something of a courtroom reputation in Nashville family law, was steady throughout in the specific way of someone who knows his documentation is better than theirs and is content to let the process bear that out. By 5 o'clock, nothing was resolved. We broke without agreement. I drove home on I-65 in rush hour traffic and sat in it for 40 minutes and genuinely did not know how it was going to go. Month 8 was the low point. Natalie's attorneys had filed a motion challenging the classification of 2 of the 4 years of transfers as marital waste, and for about 3 weeks it looked like the total recoverable amount might be significantly reduced. I sat in Garrett's office on a Wednesday afternoon, and he walked me through the scenario, and I did the math in my head and thought about what the reduced number meant against the 14 months of process I'd already been through. I drove home that night and sat in the Brentwood house. She'd been gone 4 months by then. The rooms in a particular state of inhabited but not arranged. That happens when a person is living alone in a house built for. That feeling lasted about a week. Then Susan submitted a supplemental filing that closed the interpretation Natalie's attorneys had been trying to open, and Garrett called to say the motion had been denied. I ran into Dale in June. He called me actually. I hadn't reached out since the bar conversation in March. I'd been managing too many other things to deal with the secondary situation. He said he'd heard we were separating and he wanted to talk. We met at the same bar near the Gulch. He didn't wait long. He said he'd known that Ryan was still in Natalie's life. He'd run into them together at a restaurant downtown about 2 years earlier. Dinner, clearly not a casual thing. He'd known what he was seeing. He'd thought about telling me probably 50 times and had talked himself out of it every time. He said he'd convinced himself it wasn't his place. He said he'd told himself maybe he was misreading it. He said he told himself a lot of things that he no longer believed had been the right things to tell himself. He looked tired saying all of it. I sat with it for a moment. 2 years. He'd known something real for 2 years. He'd been at my house for Thanksgiving. We'd gone to a Predators game together in January, and the whole time he'd had this thing he wasn't saying. I thought about being permanently angry about that. I thought about what that would cost me on top of everything else I was already paying. I said, I know. He looked up. I said, I figured out you knew something that night at the bar in March. I didn't push it because I was in the middle of something that needed to happen a certain way. He nodded. He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say things they mean. I said, I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter that you didn't tell me. It does matter, but I also can't pretend I know exactly what I would have done in your position. I've thought about that a lot since. What would I have done if I'd seen something at a restaurant and had to decide whether to tell my closest friend that I thought his wife might be having an affair? I'd like to believe I would have said something, but I'd also like to believe a lot of things about myself that I don't actually know for certain. We finished our drinks. He paid. We hugged in the parking lot in the way men who don't usually do that sometimes do when the situation is big enough to require it. We still talk. It's not entirely the same as it was. Some things shift and don't shift back, but it's there. The business valuation fight was the center of the divorce. Natalie's attorneys made their case. The LLC had been formed using her separate professional expertise and contributions. The capitalization was arguably traceable to her separate premarital savings. The business was her separate property. Our case, supported by Susan's 43 pages, the capitalization was substantially traceable to marital funds through a documented series of transfers. The business interest was a marital asset. Under Tennessee law, marital assets are subject to equitable distribution and documented dissipation of marital assets. Intentional depletion without the other spouse's knowledge or consent is a factor courts consider in determining what equitable actually means. The business valuation itself was fought over for 3 months. Natalie's side hired a valuation expert. We had our own. The gap between their number and ours was about $80,000. The court ultimately landed at $420,000 for the full firm, which put the 40% stake at $168,000. After distribution calculations and the separate marital waste claim, the settlement came to just under $340,000. There was a period in month 10 where I wasn't sure how it was going to land. Natalie's attorneys were good. She was a better strategic thinker than I'd fully appreciated, and I say that without particular bitterness, just as an accurate assessment. She understood leverage, and she used what she had. There was a mediation session in November that ran 6 hours and ended without resolution, and I drove home that night genuinely uncertain. But Susan's documentation was airtight. Transfer by transfer, category by category, 4 years of financial records that told a clean and specific story. Numbers don't get confused. Numbers don't make judgment calls about what to say and what to leave out. They just sit there and mean what they mean. The court agreed with our position. Certified quarterly payments, 18 months. The first one arrived on a Thursday morning in January, deposited electronically while I was at my desk working through the punch list on the I-840 interchange project. My phone buzzed with the notification. I looked at it for a while. I'm not sure exactly what I felt. Not triumph, that's not quite right. Something quieter than that. Something closer to the feeling at the end of a long and difficult project, when the final inspection comes back clean. You don't celebrate exactly, you just recognize that it's done. I called Patricia to confirm the transfer had processed correctly. She said it had. I thanked her for everything, and she said it had genuinely been a pleasure, and I believed her. I sold the Brentwood house 4 months after the divorce was finalized. The equity from 4 years of appreciation and mortgage paydown came out to another $94,000 on my side of things. I put it toward a smaller place in East Nashville, a 2-bedroom Craftsman off Gallatin Pike. Hardwood floors, good bones, kitchen that needs some updating but works fine for now. A backyard with a section of fence that needs replacing, and some thin spots in the grass along the back where it doesn't get enough sun. Sound familiar? Cooper approved of the new place immediately. He investigated every room on move-in day with his standard methodical thoroughness. Nose to the floor, corners first, then the middle of the room, then wherever the light was best. He settled on a patch of afternoon sunlight in the living room, and has been returning to it every day since, with the devotion of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for. I don't know much about what Natalie's life looks like now. She and Ryan are engaged. A mutual friend mentioned it without thinking, and then immediately looked like she wished she hadn't. The consulting business is still operating. She's still at the logistics company. I know this because Cooper and I live in the same city, and information like that makes its way to you eventually, whether you're looking for it or not. I don't know what she thinks about that Saturday morning at the kitchen table. I don't know if she'd say the same things again, or if she's thought about them differently with some distance. Whether that you were stable, you were good lives in her head the way it lives in mine, differently I assume, but there nonetheless. I've stopped trying to figure out what she feels. I spent enough time during those 14 months trying to map the interior of a person who had always been operating on a different set of coordinates than I understood. At some point you accept that you can't see the full picture from where you're standing, and you stop trying. What I know is this: I came home one Tuesday in March with a parking receipt in my hand, and I stood in a dry cleaner parking lot, and I made a decision. Not about the marriage. That decision had already been made for me, years before I knew to make it. The decision I made was about how I was going to handle what I was standing in. I was going to find out exactly what was true. I was going to do it carefully and completely. I was going to take as long as it required. I'm a project manager. I manage complexity for a living. I identify what's supposed to happen, document what's actually happening, trace the gap between them, and figure out what it costs and who's responsible. That process works the same whether you're building a highway interchange, or reconstructing 4 years of financial transfers, or sitting across a kitchen table from someone and letting them explain themselves. You start with the data you have. You get more data. You hire the right people. You don't move until the picture is complete. And when it's complete, you act on it with whatever clarity you've managed to assemble. The total, when everything's settled, $340,000 from the divorce settlement, $94,000 from the house, a 2-bedroom Craftsman in East Nashville, and a dog who doesn't know or care about any of it. I've started on the backyard. I replaced the fence section last month. Pressure-treated pine should hold 15 years easy. I'm putting down new sod in the thin spots once the overnight temperatures stabilize. I've been thinking about a raised bed along the back fence. Tomatoes maybe. Something that requires consistent attention and gives something back in proportion to what you put in. Cooper approves of the yard work. He supervises from a safe distance and occasionally investigates whatever I've been digging. I've got a site visit tomorrow morning out on I-840, new interchange contract, 18 months of work ahead if we execute it right. The kind of project that requires getting the foundations exactly right before anything else can go on top of it. Getting down to the stable substrate, building from there. I know how to do that. I'm going to take my time.